Okay, so to jump into this, deep dive oaks. One of the biggest things to remember about oaks is we often refer to white oaks and red oaks. And what this is in reality is that we are referring to two different groups of oak trees, the white and the reds. Both of these groups contain multiple species that will have a variety of differences between them, but most of those differences are appearance based. They're going to behave roughly the same, and even a lot of their appearance traits are going to align with each other within that group. So there are other kinds of oaks, there are black oaks and other ones. Tonight, I'm just going to limit this to the white and red oak groups and talk about the issues that occur with them for the most part. So a little bit on the white oak, and you're looking at a white oak in this picture right here. I'll go back for a second. This one, I believe, is a Quercus albus, your usual white oak. So within the white oak group, several species that are included would be our swamp white oak, the overcup oak, bur oak, chestnut, and chinkapin oak, and post oak. And these are trees that I regularly see on my route into work, around my office, and get calls on fairly regularly. White oaks are a very popular tree to plant. Easy way to know if you are looking at a member of the white oak group, and I, as someone who works in this area, absolutely love this. The leaves will have the oak leaf appearance, but they will be rounded. They won't have pointy parts on them. The bark is going to be scaly in appearance rather than furrowed, and acorns are going to have raised bumps on the tops of them where the cup is holding in the seed itself. This makes them very easy to tell apart and makes my job very easy too. Here's a close-up of a white oak leaf. Like I said, this is Quercus albus, this particular species. And this is just a great picture of this leaf. I love how they got such a great resolution on it. This leaf is also displaying a few signs of disease here. I'm actually going to mention the disease that this one is showing, but this is perhaps the best example of an easy way to identify a white oak. You can very clearly see that the lobed leaves are all rounded. There are no pointy parts to them. So you know the minute you look at that, that is definitely a member of the white oak group. Now, if we look at our red oaks, they look a little bit different. So as you could see on this one, you could see that the leaves actually have points on them. They have little bird points coming right off of the edge of them. And this is going to remain true for all members in the red oak group. You may see some leaf rounding in a few members, but for the most part, they're going to have points on them. Even if the leaves seem a little bit rounded, they're going to still have that pointed part just coming right off of the rounded area. So species that are going to be included in this, oh shoot, the slide is not correct there. The species that you're probably going to be most familiar with is going to be the northern red oak, and that's the leaf image I was showing you here, Quercus rubra. This one is by far the most common one, and I bet if you went out to your yard, especially this time of year, you're probably going to find a lot of these leaves blowing around, and it's only, of course, going to get worse if you live in a treed city like I do. The last point on this slide, however, is correct. Leaves are going to have those pointed tips, like I was saying, and the bark is going to be furrowed. So it's not going to have a scaly appearance. It's going to look like a furrowed, it's going to have that furrowed appearance. Typically, I kind of see that in like in ash trees. If you're familiar with them, they have a somewhat furrowed appearance in their bark. All right, so a little bit on the care and maintenance of oaks. This can be a little deceptive because oaks grow very easily, especially if you live like where I do in Terre Haute. We live in a tree city. So that means pretty much every street has trees growing on it. I have two fairly large oak trees on my property right now, and every year the squirrels will take all of the acorns, plant them in my yard, and then promptly forget exactly what they did, which means that I'm pulling oaks out of just about every spot in my yard where I don't want them to be, including my gutter, my garden, and in the potted plants. What's really interesting about oaks is just how successful they are at germinating and getting started. When I pull them out of my potted plants and gutters and such, they are actually getting to become saplings. I mean, they've got a few inches to them and they're developing very successfully. They won't survive, obviously, but they'll definitely get a start. However, as successful as these trees are, they do need a little bit of care and maintenance. And there are particular reasons behind that. So the first reason, and this is true for any plant that you get, is that when you plan to plant oak trees, you need to make sure that you're making good choices. And those choices need to include plants that are free of any kind of insect infestation and disease traits. And if you see plants in a home garden store or something like that that are showing signs of disease, you probably want to pick a different store. A lot of these diseases will come from exposure to other plants that have them. And you want to make sure you avoid that right out the gate. That's an easy thing to set yourself up for failure with. You're going to want to assume that new transplants are going to need 1 inch of water until they establish. That won't remain true after establishment. Oaks are very, very resilient, like I said, but until they get to that point, they're going to need that 1 inch of water per week, I should have said, to make sure that they're able to develop successfully. Oh, and Patty, thank you for adding that, by the way. All right, so the next point on here, the soil should fully cover the root ball and remain loose. And you want to avoid getting excessive mulch on that. And there's a very, very important reason for that. So oaks have tap roots. And most people think that since they have tap roots, they don't really need to worry too much about root care and positioning. They'll just go ahead, throw them in there, and they think they're fine. However, if you grew up around oaks or if you've had an oak in your yard for a long time, you know pretty well that those roots spread really far for something that's supposed to have a taproot. The oak roots can spread out very easily, and they typically only sit at a depth of about 18 inches. Now, when I was growing up at the school that I went to, there was an oak tree in the yard where we had recess, and its roots were barely under the soil surface at all, which means it probably wasn't planted correctly. But you could very easily see all the roots, you could trip over them, and I pity the people who took care of the lawn there because they probably had to avoid mowing them and damaging the roots. And that's probably one of the biggest problems that you're going to have with an oak. Since those roots are very significant, they're big, and they like to remain close to the surface, it's very easy to accidentally damage them with equipment or digging, or maybe they just encounter something else. There has been several pieces of really interesting research that have also shown how trees with roots like this tend to connect up with other trees through mycelial fungus and begin to share a lot of chemical traits and communication between each other, which is just a neat science thing I wanted to share with all of you that I learned some time ago. Now, some of the good things that you can do for some good preventative care of oaks. This is one, you guys know I always say this, test your soil pH. Oaks are going to be sensitive to iron chlorosis. And if your soil is lacking in iron, if your soil pH goes too acidic, they're going to begin experiencing chlorosis. You'll see the leaves begin to yellow, and the tree, if it's a large tree, it probably won't die, but it's definitely going to suffer. And smaller trees that are trying to establish may not be able to survive that. So choose your planting locations with care. And if you can't choose the location, if the oak's already established and you just like bought the yard and the house, then look into different kinds of fertilizers that you can get to try to make up that difference, because that's going to be one of the biggest problems in the abiotic environment that oaks are going to have to deal with. Now, one of the biggest issues that I see with oaks outside of disease or insects is how people prune them. Oak trees do need pruning. And the reason I say this is twofold. One, pruning is going to make a healthier tree. Just like with any other plant, pruning will help you care for it. It'll help remove those limbs that could potentially be an opportunity for disease. And you're just going to do much better with that tree. The other reason is that if you have an oak tree, the limbs, when they come off, typically are pretty large. And you want to make sure you prune them away before they fall off and do something like hit your house. One of my oak trees in my backyard actually is showing signs that it needs that kind of care. And I've already had a few large branches fall off. Thankfully, no damage, but it's something that I'm going to have to start talking to an arborist to get that handled before it becomes a major problem. Obviously, right now, you're probably thinking about the stormy weather that we've had. We, over here in Terre Haute, while I don't know how many of you experienced this, but over here in Terre Haute on Tuesday, we had a really strong storm go through, and we saw throughout the city a lot of branches got knocked down. And I saw this throughout Clay County and Owen County as well. Now, what you want to do is if storm damage occurs to your trees, unless you are experienced with this on your own, contact an arborist. There are several arborist businesses throughout this area and throughout the state of Indiana. And there are lots of easy ways to look up certified arborists. You want to contact them to make an arrangement to get your tree taken care of, because oaks get very tall and I wouldn't want to try getting up there myself to do it. I do not have the equipment or the knowledge to do that myself, and it could be very dangerous. Contact an arborist, make sure they show you proof that they have insurance, because this is dangerous work. That's the best way to handle storm damage to your trees. And don't try to do it on your own unless you know what you're doing, because it can be quite dangerous and it can be a challenge, especially when it comes to avoiding property damage. Okay, so that was short, right? Because that's really all there is to oak preventative maintenance. Like I said, they're very resilient trees. They can handle a lot of things on their own. So what I want to get into now is a little bit on some of the diseases that can really nail oak trees. That can be a really bad problem. Thankfully, I have yet to see many diseases that can take out an oak. Most of them are going to be able to survive the experience of disease without a whole lot of trouble. Usually diseases only become a problem when oaks are just starting to establish. Now, all the diseases I'm going to talk about here, I think I'm only talking about 2 or 3 of them. They are fungal diseases, which means that most of them can be handled through applications of fungicide and proper planting and spacing of the plants themselves. So the first one, this one is kind of my own personal demon, known as Anthracnose. This is a very common disease amongst a lot of different plants, including trees. They are particularly bad amongst dogwood and sycamore trees. It spreads very, very easily. What you'll see often is that sycamore will be a source point for the disease, and it'll spread to trees like dogwood, oak, cottonwood, and a variety of other plants. It can be lethal to dogwood, and I'm a little bit concerned because I have 2 dogwoods in my yard, and I'm pretty sure they're infected. Oak can get anthracnose as well. Most oak can survive anthracnose fairly easily. The leaves may become a little bit unsightly, but they'll get through it. However, it can be particularly damaging to our white oak, Quercus albus. So like I said, just reiterating here, most landscape oaks really won't take much damage from this. They may look a bit unsightly, but they'll get over the disease by the time the next season comes around. Now, symptoms of this include darkened leaf veins, like in that image you just saw there. And you'll also see distortion and shriveling of the leaves. They'll begin to bend out of shape. They may roll a little bit. And then eventually there'll be fungal pads that will develop from the infected tissue, I believe on the undersides of the leaves. I'm going to go back a couple of slides here so you can get a good look at what the disease looks like. You can see here, it's this kind of blotchy covering that's very thick on different portions of the leaves, and it has a clear defining line of yellowing leaf tissue. You can also see in one of the leaves and the top left leaf there, you can see how it's beginning to darken along the leaf veins as well. And these are pretty telltale traits of this disease. This makes it fairly easy to identify when it does strike oak trees. Okay, so this is a fungus, like I said, so it is going to take primary advantage of wet periods of time. So times like this are going to be great for disease transmission. However, we're entering the fall season, so most diseases probably won't take hold very easily. It's more in the spring that this is going to be where you want to be concerned. Water is going to splash between tree leaves, which is going to spread the infection between different trees, which is why you want to make sure you have that good spacing between your plantings. Mature leaves are going to be more resistant to infection, while younger leaf tissue is much more easily infected. So if you have a good, strong, mature oak that puts out its leaves early enough, and they're able to grow well, then most likely this disease really isn't going to matter a whole lot to you. All right, so this one is perhaps the nastiest disease that we deal with in oak leaves, and this is called oak wilt. This disease has a few telltale signs, though if you were looking at this image right here, you might scratch your head a little bit and kind of wonder if it isn't similar to what you see with our previous one, Anthracnose. So let's go over this a little bit. This is a fungal disease known to occur in Chinese chestnut and the red oak group. So it will pass between them. Now, unfortunately, this disease is very detrimental to red oak. It can actually begin taking out trees, and with a bad infection, it can kill a tree within 1 year. So it's definitely challenging to work with. The symptoms are going to occur from the top first. So you're going to see them spread from the very apical branch on downwards. The leaves will begin to dull in color, and they're going to start yellowing or beginning to bronze, like you saw in that first image. And then you're going to see leaf distortion in the form of curling occurring. So let's go back to that previous image real fast. There we go. So if we take a look at this, you could definitely see the yellowing and bronzing on the leaves. You could see them beginning to curl upwards, like in that one leaf second from the left. You could see it beginning to curl. So those are ways that you can tell the difference between this disease and anthracnose, and also use the fact that it begins from the top down. All right, so back to where we were. All right, the other way that you can tell if this is oak wilt is that the sapwood is going to have dark streaking evident. So if you have what looks like an infected branch, you're going to need to prune that branch anyways. So go ahead and cut it off and then begin to shear off a portion of the bark so you can see the sapwood, and you'll see dark brown or black streaking within there. And that will just flat out confirm that you're looking at oak wilt. Eventually, the leaves are going to drop off of the tree, and the tree may very well die at that point. Unfortunately, it is very rough to our red oaks. Easiest way, like I said, towards the beginning of this to try to combat this disease is you want to use a fungicide earlier the better. That's going to make it so that you can begin to work prophylactically and avoid disease altogether. If you begin to try to do an application while the disease is active, you might hold it back some, but you definitely will have a little bit of loss. So I would react earlier. Okay, our next disease, this one looks awful no matter which way you cut it. This is oak leaf blister. The good thing is the disease is not lethal. Unlike oak wilt, this one is just ugly, but it's not going to kill a tree. Thank goodness for that. This is yet another fungal disease. It generally just damages the leaves, but it won't utterly destroy them. The leaves will still be photosynthetically active. What it's doing is that it's just using a portion of the leaf tissue to reproduce. And it's going to take the form of these raised blisters that you saw in the previous image. And you're going to see that develop on the surface of the leaf. And there's going to be, let's go back to our previous slide. You can see how there's kind of an indentation on the top surface of the leaf. And then when you flip it over underneath, you're seeing where that indentation is gone. You're going to see fungal mycelia or hyphae begin to develop out of that bump. And that's where the spores are going to come from that will allow this particular fungus to spread. But like I said, the good thing is this is not a lethal disease. It's not going to kill an oak. It just makes it really, really unpleasant to look at. This is one of those diseases that I would look at and go, I wouldn't waste my money trying to treat it. Unless you are really determined to have your oaks look really good, this is one that I just wouldn't worry about. But I at least wanted to make sure that you were conscious of it so you knew what to do in case it appeared, and that way you didn't panic wondering what was going on. All right, so let's dive into our insects. So there are just 3 insects I'm going to talk to you guys about. Many of you know I'm an entomologist, so I love talking about these guys, and I'm always going to cover them. Our first insect, this is one of our nastiest ones. This is an invasive species known as the gypsy moth. I don't particularly care for that name, but it is what we have to work with for the moment. The gypsy moth is one of our moths and butterfly groups. It is a lepidopteran, which means it will produce a caterpillar. The caterpillar is the damaging form of this insect. It will consume a lot of leaf tissue on a variety of trees, from hemlock all the way to oak. What will happen is if you see the presence of these caterpillars, they will crawl up the surface of the tree bark, and you'll see them very clearly migrating, because what they'll do is they'll crawl up the surface of the tree, eat leaf tissue, and then crawl back down where they'll be safe from predators, and they'll try to pupate and get into their overwintering forms, or get into their adult forms, I'm sorry. The adults do not damage plants. They do not actually have a digestive tract, so they can't eat food. However, they can take in liquid water, which I think is actually kind of fascinating because they don't have a digestive tract to absorb that water. So what's going to happen with this insect is it will overwinter as an egg. The larvae are going to emerge in the spring, and that's when they're going to start feeding. Now, the good thing is in that first image you saw, the larva has very bright red coloring. It's got very spiky looking hairs coming out of it. They are extremely obvious. You will know when you have them. The pupation of these insects is going to finish in the spring, and then the females, which are flightless, are going to use pheromones to attract the flighted males to them for mating. The males look like the moth you saw in that first image. I'm going to go back to it just for reference. So you can see the caterpillar there. It's got that bright red and bright blue coloring on its abdomen, and trust me, this will stand out. The males, they almost look like a leopard moth, but they'll have 2 dots, one on each forewing, along with that black band that's right near it. That's going to be how you're going to know it's a gypsy moth. So one interesting fact I also wanted to share with you, apparently there was a study done, I think in England, where they looked at these moths that were infesting trees near a coal plant. And they realized that some of the moths had begun to adapt to the environment rather well, because the trees that were nearest the coal plant were getting covered in coal ash, and the moths were adapting to the color change in the tree. So the moths began to get darker in color, better able to hide from predators on their host trees. And I thought that was just really fascinating how quickly adaptation can occur. All right, our next insect here is our oak leaf aphid. So this is probably the most common insect that I find on oaks. They can get really, really nasty. They won't kill a tree. They definitely won't take out an oak tree. They'll make it look unsightly, and if you have an infestation, it can get a little gross. So what it is these are sap feeders, just like all other aphids. They have a unique life cycle where they'll produce living forms. So what happens is there will be a form of aphid that'll be born out of an egg. It will fly to a tree, and then it'll give birth to the next generation. And those aphids after that will actually give live birth to their daughter clones. They won't lay eggs, they'll just reproduce asexually and give live birth. What'll happen is as they feed, the leaves will begin to shrivel and they'll begin to look pretty nasty. The leaves will wilt. They may become kind of liquidy, I guess. You put them in your hand, squeeze them. You could definitely feel like they were spongy, exuding a lot of liquid. Part of the problem with aphids also is they produce honeydew. The aphids will drink the sap of the leaves, but they won't be able to process all the sugar they get out of it. It would be toxic to them. So what'll happen is they'll exude that sugar out of organs on their bodies called cornicles, and that sugar we refer to as honeydew. That honeydew is going to drop onto the leaves, and it's going to promote the growth of sooty mold, which can make your leaves look even worse. In really bad infestations, unfortunately, well, I should say this first. So aphid populations can develop very, very rapidly thanks to that asexual reproduction that they do. So when you see really bad infestations, they can get so bad that you could literally have aphids raining on your head, just slowly falling through the air. I've actually seen this for myself. It's awful. And I've definitely known a few landowners who just absolutely hated having these things around. However, even when you have really high populations of these aphids, it's very rare that a tree is able to die from their presence. They simply can't do enough damage to them fast enough. Aphids are kind of like cattle. They'll feed for a long period of time wherever they settle down. They don't travel very easily to new leaves, so that's why it typically It's very difficult for them to take out a tree. However, plants that are in a weaker or already compromised condition or new shoots that are coming off can die back if there's enough pressure on them from oak leaf aphid. All right, folks, we are right at the half-hour mark, so thank you guys for paying attention this evening. I've got my contact information right here. I've also got links to the Purdue Ed Store, which has a lot of our publications and other information that may help you out with a variety of problems, as well as a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. They can help identify diseases and other issues that are occurring. And please feel free to work with your extension educator to help you solve those problems.